Hi everyone, so we're going to be talking about the endocrine system now. If you have not taken out your lab manual and read pages 398 to 401, please do that now and then come back to the video. So the endocrine system that we're talking about is the major communicator throughout the body. So our nervous system that we've already been over last semester, at the beginning of this semester, we talked about how it is our control center. Well, the endocrine system is going to work together with the nervous system. If you remember when we talked about the nervous system, we talked about the nervous system having this sort of rapid, quick, short-term reaction, and then the endocrine system kicking in to be a longer-term reaction. The endocrine system, very different than the nervous system in its type of communication. Now, the nervous system communication is going to use the synaptic communication. We're traveling with neurotransmitters across the synapse, or in certain circumstances, we will be seeing those adrenal neurotransmitters put into the bloodstream. Now, that is more similar to our endocrine communication because we're going to see our endocrine communication using hormones or chemical messengers that are going to travel from our endocrine organs to our target cells through the bloodstream. Now, I want you to pause here. I want you to go to page 405 in your lab manual, and I want you to answer the questions. Number 2, which is define a hormone. Number 4, which is define your target cell. And then I want you to answer number 5, which is if hormones in the bloodstream travel in the bloodstream, why don't all tissues respond? So take a minute, answer those questions, and then come on back to the video. Welcome back. Now, the endocrine system, different than some of our other systems, like say the urinary system, where the organs of the urinary system are going to be sort of condensed into a specific area. The endocrine organs are going to be scattered throughout the body. And what's also unique about the endocrine organs, or some of the endocrine organs, is that they can also have other functions. So we're going to see some of them in the central nervous system, for example. We're going to see exocrine secretions coming from the pancreas into the digestive tract. So when we start mapping out this endocrine system, we're going to be looking at a broader area than we normally would look for our organ systems. Like many of the other systems, the endocrine system also has primary organs and secondary organs. We're going to see the primary and secondary organs both scattered throughout the body. Our primary endocrine organs, we're going to be looking at the production of some of the major hormones that will dictate the release of other hormones from some of the secondary endocrine organs, or dictate that communication between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So our hypothalamus, we saw that in the brain. Our hypothalamus is producing ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone, which has control over the loss of water in our body and our urinary system, and oxytocin, as well as some of the regulating hormones, or regulatory hormones that we're going to see. Now, our pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus through the infundibular stalk. The pituitary gland sits in the sella turcica. The sella turcica is part of that sphenoid bone, and for those of you who were in my class, remember we talked about how it's this little Turkish saddle. So picture your Turkish soldier in the red fez sitting in that little Turkish saddle, or the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone, holding on to the reins in front. Okay. Perfect spot for the small pituitary gland that sits right in there. The pituitary gland does have an anterior and a posterior lobe, which are going to be responsible for very different things. The anterior lobe is going to be releasing our trophic hormones, or our regulatory hormones. Our posterior lobe is going to be responsible for the release of our oxytocin and our ADH that the hypothalamus has created. Inside the brain as well is that small pineal gland, which we saw just posterior to that hypothalamic area. Remember, it was very round, very small spot that you could very clearly see when we did our sagittal section of the brain. The pineal gland is responsible for melatonin, which I'm sure most of you know. Melatonin is a sleep regulating hormone and helps with our circadian rhythm, our 24-hour cycle. Okay, so as we move outside of the central nervous system now, we will be looking at this thyroid area. So the thyroid gland is producing our thyroid hormones. Thyroid gland sits at the anterior of the neck and sort of wraps around the lateral sides to part of the posterior of our cervical area. Okay, it is a fairly large gland, and it does contain the paired parathyroid glands. The parathyroid glands are going to sit on the posterior surface, two small glands on either side of the thyroid gland embedded into the thyroid tissue. The parathyroid glands are going to produce parathyroid hormone, or PTH, and the thyroid gland, the thyroid hormones, also responsible for calcitonin. And we're going to talk about the functions of these hormones as well, and you'll do that in lecture. Moving downwards, we're going to see the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands will sit on top of the kidneys. They're also called suprarenal glands, so top of the kidneys, or sometimes they're referred to as the pyramidal glands because they're a little bit pyramidal in shape. The adrenal medulla and the adrenal cortex are going to release different hormones. The adrenal medulla is going to be responsible for releasing epinephrine, norepinephrine. This is what we're talking about when we talk about that, that autonomic nervous system. The cortex is going to be responsible for, most importantly, our androgens, our aldosterone, some cortisol that will be building on these. Again, we're going to go over what all of these hormones are in just a few minutes. The pancreas is producing our insulin and our glucagon. The pancreas is this little corn cob looking organ here that's tucked into this first 25 centimeters of the small intestine. And it is an endocrine and an exocrine gland. So it will have digestive function as well. Now, I want to remind you all that in many of the pictures, it is shown in this yellow color. In life, it is really a pinkish, grayish color, not yellow, okay? Now, when we start talking about our secondary endocrine organs are scattered as well, and they will have different functions. Mostly, we're going to see these functions being in response to some other endocrine hormone that will have its effect on them as the target cell, and then they will in turn release a hormone in response. So our gonads, obviously male the testes, female the ovaries, we're seeing the release of our sex hormones in response to our anterior pituitary releasing our regulating or our trophic hormones. The kidneys, the digestive tract, and the adipose tissue in the body will all also act as secondary endocrine organs. The thymus is going to sit, this is your thymus here, it is going to sit in this sternal area, and it will actually decrease in size as we age. So after puberty, the thymus is going to decrease in size as we get older and move on through adulthood. In fact, it gets very small and atrophies greatly the older that we get. The heart will also have some endocrine function as well. We'll talk about that when we get to the cardiac system, cardiovascular system mostly. I want to take a minute to look at the pituitary gland here. If you want to follow along with me, it is on page 399 in your lab manual. Now, the hypothalamus is inferior to this thalamus area, okay? And the hypothalamus is going to be responsible for producing some of our regulatory hormones and also producing hormones that will be released directly through that posterior pituitary gland. Connected to the pituitary through this infundibular stalk here, the anterior pituitary deals with these regulatory hormones, and the smaller posterior pituitary, again ADH, and our oxytocin. The hypothalamus is also going to directly have input through this adrenal gland as well, and the secretion of our epinephrine and norepinephrine from our ANS of our nervous system, our autonomic nervous system, okay, from the adrenal medulla. Now this anterior pituitary, again, much larger than the posterior pituitary lobe, but they do both connect directly to the hypothalamus. The only other place we're going to see something that is this direct connection we're going to talk about is the digestive tract. Not that there aren't others, but this is probably the only times we're going to talk about portal systems in the body. Now, a portal system is really cool and interesting. And we'll talk a little bit more, like I said, when we get to the digestive system and when we start talking about the blood vessels as well. But it's important to note here that this direct connection between the capillary system of the hypothalamus and the capillary system of the pituitary gland allows these hormones to enter the bloodstream undiluted. Normally, wherever blood returns into the capillary system, it will go all the way to the heart before it gets redistributed. In this case, it is not going back to the heart. This capillary network and the capillary networks of the pituitary are going to be directly connected. This anterior pituitary gland connection to this hypothalamic capillary area will allow for whatever hormones that are being created to directly enter the anterior pituitary before they are released into the body. This posterior pituitary area is still somewhat connected, but it does not have this direct portal system that the anterior pituitary does. The direct connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary allows for the release or inhibition of hormones. So now the hypothalamus is going to secrete our regulatory hormones. Our regulatory hormones are going to either release our RH hormones or inhibit our IH hormones. The RH and IH, or releasing or inhibiting hormones, are going to come from this hypothalamus area, and they're going to dictate the release or the inhibition of release from this anterior pituitary area. Now I want you to go to page 399 in your lab manual, and I want you to take a minute to look at our hormones that are being released from the anterior pituitary from our posterior pituitary on page 400. And work through the names. We're going to look at the stimulus for the release of those hormones, the target for those hormones, and the effects for those hormones. When you finished with that, come on back to the video. Okay, so now that you're familiar with the names of these hormones and their targets and their effects, let's look at this pathway for release. Now, I really like this chart because it's a very clear pathway showing this negative feedback loop that's connecting the hormones that are being released in the body back to our regulatory hormones of the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. The hypothalamus is going to dictate this release of these hormones. So what will happen is the releasing hormones will come from the hypothalamus and dictate that the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland releases our hormones from the pituitary. So our RH, remember those are releasing hormones, are going to dictate the release of the hormones from the pituitary gland. Now, these are our stimulating hormones. The hormones that are released from our pituitary gland are going to act on their target organ or their target endocrine organ. In this case, for example, our thyroid releasing hormone will trigger the thyroid stimulating hormone to trigger the thyroid gland to then release our thyroid hormones. Those thyroid hormones that are released from the primary endocrine organ of the thyroid gland will then act on the target cells in the body. The release of these secondary hormones from our endocrine organs will trigger this negative feedback loop and continue on with this process of regulating